But we also started at the same time doing a course for the second year that has a little longer arc that begins maybe in the begins in the 17th century with the Enlightenment and kind of traces modernity and modernism to that particular moment. And also, um, we are doing that very specifically by placing modernity and its architecture within like an Indian or a regional or a local lens. So trying to look at the world through our particular position. This is how we started kind of thinking about that course. We realized actually that while we were developing that course, we did not know whether that sort of contextualization had been done for you guys when you guys did your second year course. Actually, we did not know that. So first thing I want to kind of so then we thought a little bit more. We thought it may be a good idea to kind of quickly kind of jump out of our current narrative and go back to thinking about modernity and its themes through our particular context, through the Indian context, and through the encounter that we had with colonialism, because it seems as if so much of our conceptions of what we call modern seem to emerge from that particular encounter. So this is where we started having this conversation. So what we did is that we kind of had, there was a plan to kind of talk about industrial utopias and then move into Le Corbusier's modernist utopias, and then move from there to kind of, the big kind of isms that shaped early 20th century architecture, constructivism, suprematism, and all the isms that we found, in the way. But we realized that maybe it'll be more useful, given the fact that you guys are now in the third year, um, to start thinking about contextualizing these isms and contextualizing the tendencies that they represent within modernity through, or refracted through, rather, not necessarily refracted through of our particular context in space and time and our particular history in particular. So one of the discussions that we had is to start thinking about the colonial modern and the kind of early modern imaginations in India and architecture of that, and then moving on to the modernist sorts of imaginations of Corbusier, etc., etc. So was that? I mean, I don't know. It was so that's the way it's going to be, unless you guys would prefer us to move to the industrial utopias and all of those things. But I guess you all don't have too much of a choice in the matter. Any suggestions? Or I mean, do we do this kind of shift in register, or do we then continue with the narrative that we had, which is largely looking at these sort of international modernisms? And now what we are suggesting for you is that we revisit those international modernisms, probably not complete all of them because then we will run out of time. But we revisit those international modernisms later once we've contextualized modernity for the Indian context. This is the general conversation I think Janella, Shirish, and I have had. Jin, Shirish, you want to add something? Sure, muted, my friend.
One of the reasons why we were also thinking of this kind of a arc or trajectory is to be able to bring to the discussion some immediate kind of in sort of changes and effects. Uh, when for example, when we are talking of industrial utopias, we are able to then bring the immediate kind of it's also to do with what our context is and has been, a little bit, in order to reflect upon some of the kind of larger kind of world changes. That's what for me was important when we discussed this.
We just had we just had a kind of small question for you guys. Do you know about the history of colonial architecture or the history of have you all looked at the 19th century in any way so far in any course that you guys have done? Anyone?
Anyone?
Nishanti?
Anyone?
Nishanti? No.
Not much. Someone says not much.
Okay, so what we'll do today is that we'll try and do that. We'll look at the encounter that this subcontinent had with the colonizers primarily the English, because it's the English that finally ended up having a great impact on the way that we kind of defined ourselves. Like, for example, I'm speaking to you in English right now. So this is a presentation that we've made. I'll just it's a slightly abridged version of the one that we had made for the for the second year, but it's very long. Okay, so if you guys get tired, just raise your hand and say, "Yeah, let's do this." Yeah, there's a person who wants to
Yeah,
talk.
someone's
Yeah,
Shreyansh.
yeah,
Go
Joe,
ahead.
say something.
So we are right now we are seeing the modern views of India. So are there any other kind of views in India which is also a major school of thought?
I didn't understand. I can't. I didn't. Can you say that again? Because your voice was garbled.
So
Shreyansh?
hello,
Hmm.
can you hear me now?
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we saw the modern views of India, right? So are there any other views other than the modern? Matlab,
So
we have
that's
seen.
that's a good question, I think, and I think I'll use this opportunity to really kind of talk about one thing, which is the difference between modernism and modernity. Hmm? Modernity is a state of being. Modernity is a state of being where we see ourselves as people in the midst of transformation. We see ourselves as people in time. We are modern beings who have been created by a system in the world. Modernism, on the other hand, is a very specific expression that comes within the culture, that comes within art, that comes within kind of, let's say, uh, what do you, architecture, music. That's a particular kind of expression of modernity. However, modernity leads to many different kinds of expressions as well. Some of them are, neo-traditional. Some of them are neo-revival. Some of them are some of them are calling for a return back into vernacular. That is also, in some senses, a modern kind of uh, urge. So, modernity is a larger phenomenon, and modernism is one architecture of those. And you are absolutely right in bringing this up because it does seem that most of our architecture today is rooted within a trajectory that, in some senses, begins with modernism. And that is something that we are trying to, in some sense, really kind of trying to come to terms with. It's not been, I mean, and it's actually fighting against the whole history of actually architectural education. So that is and that's one of the reasons why we're thinking of kind of going back into the colonial and also placing it there. Hmm? Ashwini had a question. Ashwini had a question. Why does theory of architecture always begin with modern architecture? This is also an excellent question. One of the reasons why that has happened, Ashwini, especially in our country, is because in our country, modern architecture was seen as the vehicle through which we will build a new nation. So then, therefore, if you have to train architects, it seemed as if we had to train them in modernism. That's the way it was, in some senses, imagined. So modernism and the ideas of modernism from the Bauhaus, from all these different schools, became deeply entrenched within architectural education and within architectural discourse, and actually became the way in which value of what is good architecture, what is bad architecture was determined. So that's actually how that kind of begin that actually begins, becomes the kind of generator of that entire story. I'll just tell you a quick story, and it's a story that concerns myself. So, in some senses, I can tell you. Once upon a time, a few years back, I was teaching the second year studio, which Shish and I had done for many, many years. Janela also used to be with us. Um, and we were doing a project somewhere, I think in Malvani or someplace like that. I can't remember exactly, but the student brought to my table, and I was completely guilty in this case, brought to my table a reasonably well drawn building. Okay. He was trying to design, I think, a community center or something like that. And he brought this drawing to my table, but it looked like um, kind of, this pastiche building, no, like it was clumsy looking, no. It had a plan, but on the facade it had arches, it had minarets that tried to look like a mosque, that were all pasted onto it. Okay. And immediately I balked. I was like, यार ये क्या है यार, ये कैसे हो सकता है, क्योंकि मेरा भी ट्रेनिंग ये है कि good architecture, at that point at least, good architecture seemed to, for me, to want to be modernist architecture. And then when I started to talk to him, I started thinking that मैं इतना idiot कैसा हूँ? You know, why has a certain kind of stylistic expression of architecture become so deeply entrenched in my head कि वही अच्छा है? Why can't I think about many other sorts of languages of architecture also being valid? And that's when actually that question, the difference between modernity and modernism became most apparent to me. Because what he was trying to do in terms of program, in terms of architecture, was an extremely progressive idea. He was trying to, in some sense, build a community center for the community, etc., etc. Somehow, um, the expression that he thought was appropriate for this came from his own history and background, which I thought was clumsy, but that was purely my personal opinion, which is completely faltu. Okay, uh, and it seemed as if I felt that that expression would not necessarily perform the function that he was designing it for, and automatically that placed me in a really kind of awkward position because I realized very quickly that modernism was merely an artificial expression that desired a certain imagination of who this person is supposed to be. So it's actually so deeply entrenched in all of us that it's especially deeply entrenched in architectural education. So just to kind of uh, let you know that. But it's a problem that we really have to kind of address. Is that answer your question, Ashwini, my friend? Well,
Okay.
I guess it's not the answer to that question anyway. It's
Yes.
more of
Yes.
a
Thank you.
yeah. So what we'll do is try and stop that. Okay, what we'll do is that we will not start from Corbusier. We'll come to Corbusier later. We will instead kind of start with the British East India Company. Okay, so I'm going to try and share my screen um, and tell me, guys, that you guys see the screen, guys?
Yes, yes.
Great.
Yeah.
Um, what we're going to discuss is actually how we, as kind of as Indian citizens, have been deeply kind of influenced by the past by the 200 in the past 300 years. So we're beginning with the 18th and the 19th century, and then we'll discuss the 20th century at length. One of the things that has marked the 18th and the 19th centuries is this, which is the trade routes that reached out from the 1500s all the way across the world and connected it in this kind of grand network of colonialism that started when when European countries started looking east and west and south to try and find lands for them to conquer and to gain resources from. And this, of course, has deeply marked our continent as well. This is, for example, the different colonial settlements that existed in the country from 1498 till 1739. And if you see, they are primarily along the coast because that is the place that all the ships from Europe came and landed and set up these little kind of ports from where the from where goods used to be transported up and down. The Portuguese, the English, the French, the Dutch, even the Danish actually have created colonies in India. Okay? And this is how India was at that time. The Mughal Empire was on the decline. I'm talking about the 1750s. The Mughal Empire was on the decline. The Maratha Empire was on the rise. The Maratha Empire had reached all the way south, all the way north. Delhi was kind of conquered by it, and all the way up to Bengal and Calcutta. Even today, the kind of Bengalis have kind of galis that for Marathas because they were the ones that actually created a great deal of genocidal actually murders within Bengal at that time. So there's a sort of anger that continues to exist even today for that historical fact. Um, this is what and the country was of course divided into many tiny little kind of states. They were all ruled separately by rajas, nawabs, and all kinds of people, and the British then started making deals with each of those to slowly and steadily gain control of the country, and that is the story of colonialism. What we've done for this presentation is we are going to look at the architecture that was created in British India over three phases. These are loose phases. Um, the first is when the East India Company was primarily like a trading kind of company, but slowly had gained a place where they were exerting more and more influence upon the Nawabs and the Maharajas who they controlled. In the second phase is happens after the First War of Independence from 1857. Um, it happens during the company rule in India, when the East India Company is then mandated to rule the country and has a much more kind of stronger presence in the country. And the third is when is with the British Raj, which is from 1857 onwards. We'll be looking at the architecture across each of these, right? Starting with the East India Company. So the East India Company, as you know, was a company. The first four kind of ports it set up on the country were in Surat, Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta. Calcutta was, of course, destined to become the primary center for colonial rule for actually almost the whole of the British rule in India. But the architecture that was built by in this time primarily consisted of very basic architecture. Like these are the forts that were made. This is the fort in Surat, and what happened is that within the fort there were the white kind of rulers and a few Indian communities that were allowed to settle. But most of the other settlements were not allowed to live within the fort. They had to live outside the fort, and you'll see that across the whole kind of country. This idea of the white town and the black town. Um, right. Shirish, this is yours.
Yeah. So this is actually a cemetery. It's a Dutch cemetery, which in Surat itself, built I think somewhere I think somewhere in 1650s, and of course it also has the graves of Armenian workers who were there. So let's understand the colonizers are also not always one single group. Okay, they are also a collection of people that have been brought from different places in order to work in certain ways. Okay, so that's why I find it very interesting. The graves are actually Dutch, Armenian, and British also in this place. If anyone ever goes to Surat, worth checking it out. Yeah.
So this is, like the classic kind of image of Bombay at that time. You can imagine that this is the fort can you guys see my cursor, by the way? Or you can't?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, we
good.
can.
Yeah. So this is the old fort. That is the space in between the fort. And what you're seeing up there is what was called the Black Town, where the Indians or the locals lived. In terms of the architecture that was built by the colony at that point, you didn't have kind of architects designing most of these buildings. Who you had were military engineers, and these military engineers used to carry these books from Britain with these model types, typical plans, elevation types, and then they used to then build these buildings in India as directly from the manual. So that was the way that buildings were built.
It's also called Vitruvius Britannicus, this thing.
Really? Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, Vitruvius Britannicus, yeah.
Okay.
And those are the more fancy buildings. The less fancy buildings were simple dabbas. Like this is the factory. They're like warehouse buildings just to kind of house all the grain or house all the stuff that needed to be housed before it was shipped off to Britain. Even some of the administrative buildings were built in this sort of barrack way. This, for example, is the Writers' Building in Calcutta, which is and continues to be an important space for the government for governing actually Bengal. And the houses that were built were also like basically dabbas, which is this kind of little kind of pretensions of home, like this little pediment that you're seeing on the front facade, slapped onto the building. But there's not too much work experimentation in terms of the architecture is fairly kind of rudimentary. Meanwhile, outside in the black town, you have a kind of thriving in the Indian city coming up, with its own, which is all these communities are building an architecture that responds to their own vernacular needs, the Vada type. All of these are being built just outside this pristine space of the fort. In the second phase is when the East India Company really begins to consolidate its rule over the country. Right? And in this phase, it starts making kind of relationships very clearly with the Nawabs or the kings. And usually there's a residency of a British resident who then lives within close distance of the king and is constantly advising the king on what to do. Shirish will talk a little bit about that when we come to Lucknow. But anyway, this is an important time in the history of the world too. If you think about it, this is the period within which these two extremely important modern documents are created. One is the US Declaration of Independence, which makes that radical statement that says that all men are created equal in a country that's rife with slavery. And in 1789, of course, you have that liberty, equality, fraternity of the French Revolution. These extraordinarily important things have happened at that time. Um, the Maratha power has kind of been at its highest in 1760, and from that point on, the East India Company are constantly building their strength and beginning to take over the entire country. We'll talk about these other three bars the further we come down, but just to kind of very quickly talk about other things that have happened during this time. The railways have started. We'll talk about the minute on education in a little while. Um, I've already spoken to you about the different ways in which the British began to completely take over the country. Like what you're seeing on the left is in 1795, the map of India with the yellow, the orange, really talking about the length of the Maratha rule. Okay, in less than 20 years, you look at what you have here. You have a map of India where the pink is completely under British rule, of course, including Bombay and Calcutta. But all you're seeing in pink hatch is making a deal with the British. So they really expanded their power across that entire and across that period until they virtually control the whole country. Shirish?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, one of the most important sort of modern sort of activities that happens in the Indian continent is the mapping of the entire land, right? Let's think for a minute that British are not here, or the East India Company is actually not here to just rule. They are here to actually exploit the resources of the country, and in order to do that, they need to understand what is the length and breadth of this country, what are the various sort of resources that are actually hidden under this land, and they embark on a massive we've spoken about the trigonometrical survey in the second year, but this survey actually opens up sort of the entire land, and it creates one of the first scientifically sort of documented modern maps of the world. Okay, I must say of India, uh, and allows the British to actually now start to measure the length and breadth of this nation. Yeah, the instruments are all now sort of in that sense early industrial modern instruments, including the theodolite, which in those days used to weigh tons, but you have a lot of labor here, which is actually sort of helping them to conduct a large project. The entire project spans across 50-60 years. Starting from Chennai, the first datums are starting from Chennai, and then they go towards the west and the north from those datums to create a map of the nation. Yeah.
Um, so as you can imagine, this is a really kind of small group of people who are trying to rule this new nation that they now have, which is certainly no longer only these tiny little port towns, but this entire land that exists. And obviously, they're going to need administrators for this whole large region. So what they do is that they come up with this idea. This is one of the most famous documents for our own history. This is a kind of what is called the Minute on Education by Macaulay in 1835. And I'm going to read this because it's an interesting thing that in 1835, a British kind of person says that he has no idea of Sanskrit or Arabic. He has never found even one of them. One of them are these Orientalists or people who thought that India had a great culture. I don't think anyone can. So he says that these Orientalists cannot deny that one shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. The best and most responsible course the British could take in India is to create a small elite group of Indians in the superior British language and traditions. By doing so, they would create a group to serve as intermediaries between the British and the Indian masses, a class of persons who would be Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, opinions, in morals, and in intellect. So as you can see here, there's very clearly a kind of idea that we'll take one group of people who will make actually white, but they only look brown. We will train them in the value systems of the West. We'll train them in the value systems of us, and then they will become our middlemen to be able to kind of deal with the administration of the country. This, of course, leads to the kind of creation of a particular class of people, whom, by the way, you and I, and everyone in this room, is a descendant of. Okay? This class of people, the Indian middle classes. So the Indian middle classes, of course, are trained to kind of think about India itself and their own histories as something that needs to be, that they need to be a little embarrassed about, and also to be able to develop one's own identity in the eyes of their British masters. And the training automatically, so this automatically creates a desire for the Indian middle classes to aspire to become like the British, as if the British by themselves, in many ways, represented a modern kind of way of being. And truthfully put, that was not necessarily completely wrong, because it was true that at that time in the country, you had the caste system as being extremely kind of prominent everywhere. Gender equality was definitely not nowhere to be seen. So any Indian with any kind of imaginations of the modern had only the British in many ways to kind of look to as models whom they could then aspire to become. Right? And the British also kind of started performing an entire sort of theater, a theater of modernism. And at that point, this modernism represented Greece, because it was Greece where democracy was born. And the British then saw them, their own history was reflected in the history of the Greek and the Roman empires. So they then adopted this classical motifs as ways in which they could then kind of talk about this kind of knowledge that they are bringing to the Indian subcontinent. This is the government house, designed in 1803 in the city of Calcutta. And as you can see, it's this enormous kind of building. And it's an interesting thing what Wellesley says, who was going to kind of live in this. He says that he wishes India to be ruled from a palace, not from a counting house, with the ideas of a prince, not with those of a retail dealer in muslins and indigo. So the market, which is inside the Black Town, is seen as a place for like corruption, well, actually, this is a palace that lies outside it from where this entire country can be ruled. And that is the aspirations. And you have to remember that these are not kings and queens. These are people who are working for the East India Company. Okay, um, they are administrators. Okay, and now the administrator, actually a businessman, now wants to live in a palace. And this is the palace that he's designed. I'll just take you through a few images, but look at the kinds of facilities that it has. There's a music room, a drawing room, a library. This is his house, but it's scaled like a palace. Um, this is it today. Um, this is the big dance hall there. You can imagine this aspiration to kind of have these dances where these white people would then meet each other. You have a porch from where you can watch the landscape of Calcutta. And you have a similar kind of architecture that also happens in Bombay at that time in the 1840s. This is the town hall, which was designed at that time to, and as you can see, the neoclassical aspirations continue to be there. What are the other buildings? Now, this, for example, they needed churches there. So this is the church that they designed in Chennai on the right, and on the left is the actual original church. So what they did is that the church in Chennai is an exact replica of a church built in London. It's called the St. Martin's in Fields. So literally a whole building was just simply replicated here. The West was replicated as a way to civilize India within by replicating the architecture of it. This is the plan, and as you can see, the plans also are so similar. Up is the St. Andrew's Church in Madras, and what you have below is St. Martin in the Fields in London. Right. Um, you have at the same time, of course, Calcutta becomes the capital of the country, but it's too hot for the British. We just can't deal with it in summer. So there is this entire idea of creating a series of hill stations, and these hill stations are places where the British then retreat to in the hot months of summer. And around each of these major cities, you find them. Okay, you have around Madras, you have this group. Around Bombay, you have, of course, this group. Around Calcutta, you have this group, and around Delhi, you have Shimla. And Shimla then becomes the summer capital for the British. And if you see Shimla, of course, it has these incredible buildings that were used as administrative buildings during the summer times. Um, you also have the development of this very unique particular kind of typology that emerges at this time, which is the bungalow. And the term bungalow, of course, has become something that we use almost on an everyday basis when it comes to a detached family home. Jen, you want to talk about it?
Yeah. So the bungalow becomes a typology that the British kind of directly kind of get into India. It's a new typology, because they're, as much as they are kind of looking at this country for resource, they're also missing home. And in that sense, they are looking at creating some kind of familiar site, some kind of familiar spaces. And the bungalow typology with the house situated in a large garden is something that they bring in. And so at first, like in places like this in Shimla, it is first very small houses, but like in the previous image you see, it is the PWD, housing for officers that become this dominant typology. Also, they try to kind of, and the hills, especially on the hill station, becomes this climate also which they can directly adapt to. And that is when they kind of put out, small elements like the veranda, which is common to the Indian context. And they try to add these elements to the typology, but it suddenly this aspiration for living in a certain way comes in through this through the bungalow.
Okay, so these are just a few images.
Yeah, Rohan.
And you can see the kind of transformation in the imagination of nature that is indeed in this. If you think about the image of the old Indian city and you look at this, you're immediately able to see the way that our own ideas of nature and the way that we treat hill stations or have the farmhouses can all be traced to this particular moment or this aspiration that seems to be embedded in this image.
I also would like to add one more thing at this point. So if you kind of look at the mansions or these kind of large houses in the English context, you see there is a clear separation of the living spaces of the masters, so to say, and the spaces inhabited by the people serving them. And this was very easily adapted in the Indian context, where separate quarters, separate spaces were made for the kitchens, the staff quarters, all of course within the same ground, sometimes attached as annexes to the main building. But yeah, it was very easy to adapt these spaces as well. And something that the Indians kind of took on to very easily, kind of this hierarchy between the servants and the masters.
Yeah. And at the same time, of course, the British are trying to replicate some of the institutions and the places of pleasure that they have in England, in India. So you have the clubs there, and you have all of these kinds of institutions that start coming up, and you have the emergence of the cantonment, the place where the British officers and soldiers live. And that cantonment is always separate from the main city. Shirish, I think Lucknow is next.
Yeah, I'm. Can you go to the map? Yeah.
Shirish?
Yeah. Okay. So this kind of aspiration of wanting to please the white person is not is not necessarily only coming from the sort of colonizers. It is very much sort of a movement even within the princely states in India. And I'm showing you one example, but across the entire Indian landscape, you have several of these princely states who are suddenly, in many ways, sort of waking up to this kind of imagination of what it is to be modern. And a part of that imagination of what it is to be modern is to be able to do the activities and to be able to do them with their white kind of counterparts. Yeah. And but at the same time, while that is happening, the for the colonizers, for the British, their understanding of the city is what this map reflects. Okay, if you see, you have all the institutions which are of the Nawab, okay, and which are also of the sort of British residencies, etc., which are shown in the map, and the rest of the city, which is actually this, you want to call it a black town or you want to call it a native town, is shown as one blob. Okay. But if you go to Lucknow, within within that entire pink blob, there are innumerable kinds of architectures and features which I'm going to show you in the next coming slides as well. Yeah, next. So what is this architecture? Yeah, this architecture is also built sometimes in collaboration with someone who has training in building buildings of this kind. And this is a person named Lamartine, who is a Frenchman who's come to India. He has in fact escaped the kind of troubles in France and has moved to India, but he finds home over here. He is an architect, he's a builder, he is also a surveyor, and very actively engaged in the British kind of expansion project. But he's also very close to the Nawabs of Lucknow, and he's able to bring an architecture which is in many ways sort of in some kind of ways an amalgamation, but still reinstating the kind of colonial architectural stamp. So this is a building called called Constantine, which is his residence in Lucknow, which is part of the which is now the La Martiniere School. But you'll find that the kind of decorations and the kind of sort of details very much still classical colonial. Okay, these are perhaps Greek statues that have been sort of brought and plonked over here. Beautiful building. Next. But at the same time, the Nawabs themselves are also engaged in a lot of building activity, which is quote unquote modern in that sense. Okay, so building of public projects. This is you see the red is a building called a picture gallery, which is actually always built as an exhibition gallery for the paintings of the Nawabs, and some of the most important paintings of the Lucknow Nawabs are currently hosted in this gallery. But the fact that it is actually built as a gallery itself is signifying that there's a change in the kind of programs. It is no longer part of a palace. It's not a part of a palace. It's an independent building by itself put out there. Yeah. The architecture itself, of course, is a kind of a material and spatial amalgamation. There is a veranda, okay, but the veranda is built with these slender columns, which are actually metal columns covered with stucco work. Okay, giving an impression that the heavy mass is now going to be sort of held by these slender columns. Yeah, very new ways of, and then you see the tie kind of elements which connect the two columns and also are able to then hold the arch together. This is, I think, this is built in 17. If I'm not wrong, Ron, yeah, somewhere in 1760s or 70s. Yeah. Next. Yeah, but the slide has not changed. While that is happening, within that pink blob that you saw, inside the pink blob, there is architecture which has been created, which is reminiscent of some completely other places. This is a place called Roza-e-Kazmain. Okay, it is also a Karbala, and which is directly, I mean, the architecture directly seems to be imported from somewhere in Iran. Okay, what you see, the domes on the top are actually sort of cylindrical domes which are plated with bronze plating. Yeah, very interesting architecture that goes on within the city itself. So we have to remember that it's not like it's a static place, that there's no architecture, there's nothing new that is happening. One is looking, and people are looking at many different places to bring together an identity of sorts. Next. In
Badai Mambara.
Yeah, and in Lucknow especially, I think in the 1780s or so, there's a serious famine, and the Nawab commissions a massive sort of project of for generating employment, and it's called the Bada Imamwara. I think it is one of the sort of most sort of expansive projects in those days. Commission ever. And what is the Bada Imamwara? The Bada Imamwara has a mosque. It has a stepwell on one side, and it has a huge central kind of a building with a massive dome-like structure. Okay, that is actually in many ways the public space for the people of Lucknow. Okay. Again, this is not within any of the kind of complexes of the palaces, etc. This is set outside that system, done with the money of the Nawab, engaging people to create something which is grand and sort of magnifies the scale of architecture. So while we are looking at La Martiniere building, the Bada Imamwara actually is an even bigger scale kind of a building. Yeah. Next.
So while that is happening, and as you can see, the very idea of what that this encounter with the British, this imagination of the kind of idea of progress and development, and particularly what the British are able to, in some sense, instill as value systems within that class of people, which usually happens to be the upper castes within each of the places that they do set up their centers in, is a certain idea of like equality, freedom, etc. And many Indian kind of reformers are influenced by these. And of course, one of the most famous ones is Raja Ram Mohan Roy, and we will come back to him later on. But it's interesting to kind of think about that because they also are emerging at that in this period of time. The first modernists in India actually happening at this time. And Ram Mohan Roy was, of course, the pioneer of the of a movement that was called the Brahmo Samaj, and that itself left a long legacy and influenced architecture too in the country. But of course, one of the important things was the Vidori, his kind of fight against sati was one an important kind of thing that happened, and that happened in Calcutta. And he was deeply influenced by Christianity actually and Islam when he came with many of these ideas. And there's an architecture that is built by that by them in the 1850s or so, which tries to find this sort of Indian identity. But there are other reformers also happening at the same time, and each of them is coming from a different angle. Of course, there's Phule, who in Pune is in Maharashtra, is also has also studied under in a kind of colonial school, has again been influenced by some of the ideas of equality and egalitarianism that are deeply embedded within that education system, and comes up with the first school for girls in Pune in 1848, and also starts something called the Satyashodak Samaj. So the idea of caste is also beginning to kind of you have movements that are in that sense anti-caste movements that also start in this period. But you also have a revival in Hinduism itself, which is suddenly kind of feeling threatened by these movements that are at the very foundation of Hinduism. And you have an entire group of people who try to say that Hinduism has lost its roots by excessive ritualization, and trying to go back to the Vedas and the Upanishads as the original texts within which only one God exists. And actually they try and make a case that though practicing wise there are all these different gods, in truth all of them is one God, and that is what ends up becoming what's called Neo-Vedanta philosophy, and that itself has its own legacy. And this is the Arya Samaj, which is established in Bombay in 1875. There are many more such movements. I'm not going to go into them, but it's interesting to think about all of these also as modern movements, to kind of also go back to what Ashwini was saying. That modern doesn't necessarily mean kind of only one direction. These are all different modernities. Now we come to the third phase, which is the final phase of this entire kind of group, and this is when the British Raj happens after 1857. The kind of country is thrown into turmoil because of the and Queen Victoria then steps in saying that we will rule directly this country and we'll make it part of the Raj. This is the time when actually whom we call our modernists, or the ones who build our nation as such, Tagore, Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar. This is the period in which they are born, and they are greatly influenced in this period by what's happening in the world. The other thing that happens in the world is that the American Civil War happens from 1861 to 1865, and that has a deep impact on Bombay especially, and we'll talk about that a little bit. What you also have is in 1869 the Suez Canal opening, so you have a faster route of movement to Europe from India, and you have some of these palaces that are built that we'll look at a little later. This is also the time, 1857, is when J.J. College of Art is established, and 1900 is when the architecture school actually starts. Right? So it's that period of time. Okay. I'm not going to tell you about the War of Independence. You all know it. I'm not going to kind of bore you with it. So I'm going to skip these two slides, and I'm going to talk about something that was written by Kipling, and in within this kind of period. And it's an interesting thing to read. It's in a poem called "The White Man's Burden," where he was talking about the Philippines, really, but you can talk about it in India as well. He says, "What is the fate of the white man? The white man has a burden. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' needs. I love that last line. No? That last line is take your sons and put them into exile because you have to serve whom you've imprisoned. So it's imagined, therefore, in this entire kind of thing that the Raj has the right to rule you, right to keep you captive, okay, because it is going to serve you, it is going to serve your needs. And that idea of destiny of the white man to carry the burden of the brown man justifies many of the interventions that the British Raj then makes in the country. So this is Bombay. Very quickly going to tell you what happens in this time in Bombay. Is one of the things that has happened is that because the British Raj has consolidated itself, there's no reason for the fort walls around the old fort. It's completely unnecessary. The other thing that also happens is that you have, actually this is Ulta. Anyway, next time I'll change it. Huh? The other thing that happens is that, you have the Bombay, the American Civil War has happened. So Bombay is growing really fast because all the cotton from India is actually going through the port of Bombay. So Bombay is making some pots of money. Okay. So what happens in Bombay is the institutions of modernity or British modernity, the white man's burden, are established in Bombay in the line of where the fort wall once was. So if you just look at this line has all the kind of buildings of modernity. From a railway station to a police station on the other side, you have a market, college, municipal building, a high court, a university, a museum, all laid along this ring that has, of course, become iconic of the city of Bombay. The green space that was once a place that was to separate the black town from the white town becomes an interface between the Indian city and the colonial city with all these different institutions facing that green space. Even the buildings that are then kind of that are built in this time no longer have the sort of neoclassical stuff that we saw earlier. They're no longer these kind of Greek references. Instead, what they have is references to Venice for some reason. The Gothic as an architecture is seen as an architecture that can incorporate these particular kind of response to the unique needs of Bombay. So Bombay then becomes one of the great showcases for what ends up becoming called the Victorian Gothic style. And here you can see that this is the Bombay University with its windows, etc. This is from the Doge's Palace in Venice. You can see the direct kind of copying of details and proportions that is happening. And this is the Jali work from the university. Right? Another view of the university. The High Court, right? All of these buildings. I mean, I'm sure, a history of architecture lecture will look at this differently. I'm just kind of showing you the theoretically, in some sense, where this architecture is coming from. Okay. Because what you have at this time, while you have an entire group that really believes that it has the white man's burden to civilize the brown man, what India is unique among the lands of that the British colonized, because in India they didn't encounter a savage race. They came here and saw like a culture. They came here and saw architecture like the Taj Mahal and Fatehpur Sikri. They saw languages and poetry, and they didn't know what to make of it. So because they had to in some sense justify their own kind of superiority, and they had or in some way come to reconcile their relationship with the East. So a group of people called the Orientalists emerge, and these Orientalists are interesting people because they genuinely believe that India has this amazingly strange culture that they needed to study. They did not treat it as dirt. They treated it as something of value that they needed to understand. And we owe so much of what we have kind of saved of our own ancient history to this group of people. They started organizations like the Archaeological Survey of India, like the Asiatic Society of India, that went about searching and hunting these documents that sometimes we gave two hoots about, and collected them and kept them safe and continued to study them. Embedded within this kind of idea was also otherization of like they are different from us. So there was also part of that question, but we'll talk about that maybe when we are discussing Edward Said and Orientalism. So this group of people is also building architecture. There's an architecture here that is trying to evolve and neat amalgamation between the East and the West, that is using elements from the West, that they're using plan forms from the West and overlaying them with craftsmanship and details from India. This ends up being called the Indo-Saracenic style. And it is a representative of the need to evolve a unique Indian identity that is an amalgamation of both the East and the West. Right? The Gateway of India is, of course, one famous example in Bombay. There are buildings built all over the country that are trying to do this. This is the gateway to the Victoria Memorial Hall in Chennai, I think. And you have this, which is the Senate Hall in Chennai, beautiful kind of Islamic influenced sort of decorative work on effectively a simple sort of on a simple plan. You can see the large windows kind of influenced by the Gothic, but not quite Gothic that are there. And this Indo-Saracenic comes in a variety of different flavors. This, for example, is a building built in Trivandrum by Robert Chisholm. It's called the Napier Museum, that tries to evolve a uniquely Kerala version of the Indo-Saracenic. You also have books made by these that are trying to, in some senses, help the creation of the Indo-Saracenic. These are pages from a book that is called the Jaipur Portfolio, made by a man called Swinton Jacob, who then went about kind of copying these details from ancient, from vernacular and traditional architectures in India, so that those then can be used by many architects to build these, to decorate their plans. These are some buildings that are designed by Swinton Jacob. This is the Royal Albert Hall in Jaipur, and you can see the chhatris that evoke sort of Rajasthan chhatri. This is another building designed by Mubarak Mahal, also in Jaipur, inside the palace complex. The plan is simple 9-square grid, but the ornamentation is very clearly being inspired from all kinds of different kind of, I guess, inspirations. Janella?
Yeah. Yeah. So as much as there were British kind of subjects, or rather the Britishers in India who were documenting the various buildings and trying to build in a language that looked very similar to what was already existing. They were also kind of being taken back to England and trying to build in a similar way. So, for example, this one over here is the India office in London, and if you see that there are all these arches everywhere, and the ornamentation is very similar. This is even the kind of the idea of the courtyard, for that matter. Okay, so there are some elements that are being picked directly and being replicated in England. Yeah, Rohan, next. Next slide. Or this example of a home. Okay, this is in Seldenport, and if at the bottom of the slide you will see the way people are describing this building, saying under the yellow leaves of oaks, the bridge, the waterfall, the temple pool, and then the onion domes. So these elements are being kind of picked, and whatever is kind of catching their fancy. This whole idea of performing also this thing that they have been to this exotic land and are getting these inspirations from there, and now building in a completely changed context. Also spaces, like for example, the temple pool is, if you see the image, you see it's actually a small grotto, which is in the shape of a small shrine, which looks like an Indian temple, and but it is there empty, without any deity in it, but just by the water. Also, kind of looking at these significances or kind of relationships that water has with religion in the Indian context, but then again, just taken as elements and form and put in spaces like this. Of course, again, if you see this image closely, you look at the elephants, you'll see the elephants over there. So these are all being taken as symbols of kind of Indianness, and are being built elsewhere. Yeah, next slide. Or again, this one, this is an amalgamation of various styles, some Indian, some from France, and so as much as the kind of the British Empire is looking at these colonies as they are kind of under them as resources, they're also kind of building buildings that are drawing from these examples to say that these are places that we've been to, and of course a large mass of people are not traveling to these colonies. So in a way, these become exhibitions, or these become pieces that can be exhibited for someone who doesn't know what this is, like what this unknown, where these kind of colonies are, and what do they look like. And this again is a home, a very large mansion, literally, of somebody, and it's built in this style with these little minarets, and of course not performing any functional kind of ideas of what a minaret would mean, or in the context from which it is borrowed, but they just kind of put on, or kind of slapped on as elements. Yeah, next slide. Or yeah, again, this is a conservatory that was put up in one of these very large estate grounds, and it served as a botanical garden for some time, and then it became an exhibition space. And but it was again just erected as a temporary space to house kind of some event, which was then taken down after some time. But it was, if you see the arches, the material also that was used was very similar to what they kind of picked up from one of these books, so to say, like the one, like these portfolios that were made, which looked at these very kind of Islamic or Hindu elements that they were observing all around them. Yeah, next slide. This is not in the UK, but this is in New York, and somebody who's kind of so enamored by this Indian craft, okay, that they literally had pieces from India shipped and kind of built or kind of put in as part of their own homes. For example, if you see these brackets, and this is on the facade, so if you see the rest of the building, it's like a completely straightforward brick building, but just this one kind of apartment has this a balcony, which is very elaborately made in wood. These arches, the columns, all kind of taken from India and made by Indian craftsmen, and then refitted or kind of made for this house in New York. Also, this is an image of the interiors of the same house, and you'll see that everything over there is trying to like so they're so taken in by the art and kind of craft of India that they want to have it also. There is wood, there are carpets, there are small pieces of furniture, everything that they think that they can take and kind of have this feeling of what it means to be Indian. Also, if you see the paintings in the background on the walls, and at the same time about these spaces and what they want to create, the colors of these spaces, all trying to replicate India in a foreign kind of land.
So what's
Yeah,
happening at
Rohan,
this time, of course, yeah, what's happening at this time, of course, is that the Maharajas, meanwhile, so the British had a certain fascination with India. They liked this idea of the India and the Maharajas and the elephants, and this was the sort of image that was being sold very much to the British public. And to be able to sell that image well, they needed good Maharajas also, and the Maharaja had to, in some senses, perform his Maharaja-ness. So what the British were also doing at the same time is that they were forcing, sometimes explicitly and sometimes through like kind of all kinds of pressure tactics, for the Maharajas to build themselves these enormous palaces to perform their Maharaja-ness. And in the architecture of those, the Maharajas often chose an idea of a palace that they thought would please their masters. This is one such palace built by the Shindes or the Scindias, which was once part of the Maratha kingdom that then broke up with the British. In the city of Gwalior. This is a palace that was built by them, and as you can see, it has this sort of Western-ish kind of look to it. There's not a single Indian element anywhere in anywhere in the building. Enormous chandeliers hang in ballrooms. A very westernized imagination of living largely, but also hints of something quite else. Like for example, here, where you have two kinds of dining rooms in the building. One is an Indian dining room where you sit on the floor, and the other one is a Western dining room where you sit around a table with a train that carries drinks for all the people on it. You know, it's like it actually works. And you can see this, and you also have like a silly kind of indoor swimming pool that is also part of that same same building. So you can see here the performativity, where architecture becomes some way in which one performs one identity, and the identity one chooses to perform seems to be an identity that is trying to please the masters. On the other hand, you have this building, also built by a Maharaja, Sayaji Rao, which you saw in Nostalgia for the Future, where the Maharaja is in some senses trying to develop an identity, a performed identity that is in some senses a new idea of India, an amalgamation of the best of the East and the best of the West. I won't talk about it in much detail, but Jin, you want to talk about Junagadh?
Yes. The princely states, like if you remember in the earlier part of the presentation, Rohan was talking about how the entire country was actually broken up, or kind of actually was composed of a lot of smaller kingdoms and rulers. And the princely states largely had a very important role to play in the kind of the East India Company making their inroads into the country. And later on, they also became the sites of this excessive experimentation. So since the princely state rulers were in a way the kind of most wealthiest, or they had a lot of money, they were also kind of, and of course, since they enjoyed a lot of favors with the British Crown, and so they were also traveling across like to other places, and to kind of exhibit, or to kind of make a mark, or kind of show what their reach was, or the places that they had been to. They were commissioning buildings that would, what we could classify as the eclectic, because they did not belong to any particular style. They were not being built in any like the dominant kind of way of building at that time, but they were putting together these buildings became expressions of things that they saw, they liked, and they wanted it to be part of this building that they were commissioning. It could be anything. So it would not, like if you see this image over here, you have like a tiered a stepped kind of a tiered roof with a very small kind of domes on it, or you have something like these towers, which again have a staircase that is spiraling around and then going up to form a chhatri, which is basically nothing but just like a tower to go up into. So in some ways it is a minaret, in some ways it looks there's a spiral staircase, and they had become these sites of excessive experimentation. One is definitely in the way the kind of buildings that were being built. The second was also in the urban layout, where urban form was also kind of trying to, in some ways, look at the experiments that were, or rather, already things that were existing in foreign countries. For example, especially England, when for that matter, the crescent. So and the buildings along the crescent being the ones for administration. While in Junagadh itself, over here you have another crescent, and the crescent actually becomes a space where the market is laid out. So there are very two different ways that also what they see as the spaces of kind of as intense public spaces or important public spaces, and the buildings that they are choosing to kind of string along this crescent in Junagadh as compared to the crescent, for say example, in Bath, and where that becomes only the buildings of the government. So yeah, the princely states are a very kind of interesting. They are very interesting spaces for how they are actually trying to perform these identities, or perform these relations that they have with the colonial masters.
So this is, of course, the what happens is that at the end of at the beginning of the 1900s, Queen Victoria dies. Queen Victoria has been the ruler of England for many years, and that becomes a really important event for us. It actually transforms two extremely important things happen in that last period, from 1900 to 1947, and two important architectures is what I'll just very quickly kind of show you. One is there's a Victoria Memorial Hall that is built in Calcutta that is in some senses I guess how you should call it. It's a colonial version of the Taj Mahal, and it's very self-consciously done in that way. If you study the plan, It looks like the plan of the Taj Mahal, which you see on the left, is embedded inside Victoria Memorial. It's exactly the same size. Both of them are exactly at the same scale, right? So there is a certain way in which now the British are seeing their rule in India coming to its end. To some extent, it's transforming rapidly, and in this time now they want to leave a legacy to say that we were here and this used to be us. So in the final years of the Raj is when they put together extra, like really large kind of public projects, and one of the most important public projects that they do is the city of New Delhi. This is, I think, the final kind of big moment for the Raj. And in it, they call the architect Edwin Lutyens to design the master plan and some key buildings in it. Lutyens is, by that time, a very, very famous and popular architect in England. So it's a big thing to have Lutyens come and design the city for New India. The city, of course, is designed along, is this sort of, I don't, we will talk, the master plan is inspired by cities like Washington, D.C., etc. But it's centered around two axes, what is called Janpath and what is called Rajpath. This is Rajpath. Rajpath starts off at what was the Viceroy's house and shoots out up to what was the Martyrs Memorial. This is Rajpath. It, of course, then becomes the symbol for our own kind of modern Indian identity as well. Viceroy's house is seen as a palace that from where the Viceroy will rule India. So you can see the kind of drawings that are made that are comparing the size of the Palace of Versailles with the Viceroy's house. So the Viceroy's house is really this monumental palace that from where the country is to be ruled. And the architecture itself is trying to evoke an architecture that is an amalgamation of, again, Indian and Western. Um, Here, the dome of the stupa at Sanchi is transposed upon the Viceroy's house. So you're able to kind of see the proportions and the detailing that emerges from Sanchi. Um, you also have buildings. You have this incredible Mughal garden that is at the back that is also laid out, and you have this kind of a building that is inspired by a building by what is the name of that temple? I keep forgetting.
Chaucer
Chaucer.
Yogini.
Chaucer.
Chaucer Yogini.
Chaucer Yogini, yeah, the Chaucer Yogini temple in Gwalior, which I've been to, but I can never remember the name of, right? So this is actually what's happening I'm not going to go into the details of this. If you guys are interested, and I think maybe for the blogs, there may be interesting sorts of things to kind of explore here. There are many princely states that might be interesting to explore in terms of architecture. The architecture of New Delhi may be interesting. And of course, Janpath itself is centered around, Connaught Place, which of course, which is the commercial center for New Delhi. Okay. So just to kind of leave you with that for now, what we are looking at here is actually there for this period. This period is a time when these modernists who actually are really part of building uh, many of the ideas that really shaped our own modernity, those are born during this time. Ram Mohan Roy, Phule, Tagore, Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar, all are kind of products, as they were, of our encounter with the colonial. So it's very difficult to talk about our own modernity without really discussing the aspects that made them and made a particular class of people, the middle classes, that then became central to both our struggle for modernity as well as the modernity that we chose to have as our own in the new nation, for better or worse.
Rohan, also, but we have not yet sort of gotten into the entire kind of nationalist sort of momentum of the modern. Uh, I don't. I mean, that's another segment in that sense.
Yeah.
Whether it's through the Swadeshi movement or through the Quit India movement and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah. I think what we should do for these guys is that we should allow them to start also dictating the arc of the course. Maybe right now we can give them 2 or 3 options about what they would like to do next, and we can kind of take that in the next class.
Yeah.
My feeling is that yeah. So
what we were thinking is that we should leave them with 2 questions for this class, and let them respond through their blogs with these 2 questions, or take these questions head on and let them respond on the blog as an exercise by itself. But the discussion on what the trajectory should be, I mean, what do they want next? We can maybe have it open to them right now.
Yeah, maybe we can just kind of ask them. So the first thing is, are there any questions concerning what we showed?
Yeah.
Any comments also will be fine. It doesn't have to be
Yeah.
a question. I'll leave you to kind of think about it for 2 minutes while I go get some water, and then we can kind of have a conversation. I know that these classes are long, and I'm sorry about that, but I feel guilty about having it long, but I would feel guiltier if I don't kind of tell you things. So I think we are perpetually kind of caught between this, that do I want to make you suffer my presence or our presence very long, or
But that's
do I
but
want
that's why I will change. I promise you, I will change the backdrop every time. I have promised you.
yeah,
You'll
I'll
have
do
to
that.
keep the question. I will keep my video on also.
I'm gonna go get some water, guys. If you guys have some questions, or these guys can kind of take it.
Okay. Anyone. We can talk about things.
No questions in the chat as yet.
No.
And no one's even raised their hand.
Rohan, I can hear Rohan in the back. Yeah, I'll not log down.
Nothing happening?
No, nothing.
No,
There is like a
no,
there's like
nothing. Zero.
there's an incredible dead silence, Rohan. It's like
You guys got bored or what about the story? Should we not do these stories and just do our architecture stuff? So I'll tell you, because there are three directions we can go from here. Let's say, okay, now you all will have to answer because we need an answer. There are three directions. One is that we go into the architecture of the reform movements. We can kind of look at Ram Mohan Roy and the legacy of architecture, which will reach us to Shantiniketan, to Tagore, and there's that kind of entire world that will emerge. That's one trajectory that we can do. Okay. The other one is that we kind of skip like this sort of new history-ish thing that we are doing, and we go back into the industrial utopias, modernist utopias, discuss the star architects, star architecture, etc. That is the other sort of possibility that's there. Or the third is that we kind of go ahead with kind of completely kind of the stylists, the different movements of the modernists, futurism, constructivism, all of those things. And that's the third option. What are there any other options, Shirish Jain?
no, I mean,
No, this is it, I
but
think.
Dia is saying something. She says this was really interesting
Yeah.
because when we studied the British Raj, sorry, Jin, can you just read it? Just a sec.
Yeah, she says this was really interesting because when we studied the British Raj in school, it was looked at in a very one-dimensional lens.
Yeah, I think that's the way even I learned history. My history was, if anything, worse than yours. Because these SSC textbooks at that time were like ridiculous. The British came, they were evil people. Then we had the wonderful Indians who then threw them out. End of story. I see. And it's like either. Sorry, somebody's saying something.
No, your voice is echoing.
Yeah, so like it's interesting to kind of think about the encounter with the British, not purely as one of horrificness, but just as an encounter, which we also screwed up because finally we are the ones who made the so-called Indians are the ones who made those deals, no, with the with the Brits that finally allowed them to rule us. So it's not necessarily a story only the great Indian. A lot of our so-called freedom fighters got education because of this, got a certain idea of education because of the encounter with the British. So, the question back, what would you do next? Kya kare? Your textbooks are also the same, nothing changed in that in those 30 years.
Yeah. 30 years of education, Ron, nothing has changed.
30 years. How much older am I than these guys? Yeah, I think I'm 30 years older than these guys. Yeah, 30
years.
But I would say that some things would have changed. Yeah, would have gotten a little more self-critical. No, maybe not.
But all, I think it has become less self-critical. I think.
I think that also may be because of the way that the contemporary Indian nation wants to write its history.
Yeah.
Wants to write its history. So even when you read, when I'm reading these WhatsApp forwards I get from so many people, I read them and I'm like, but this is blatantly untrue. But then I realize that it's what truth and not truth. It's just the way that the history is currently being told to make us feel like our great Indian past existed or whatever.
But Rohan, that little 1 hour thing by Romila Thapar is fantastic, huh?
Yeah, you should give it.
Yeah, it's like 1 hour. 1 hour of listening to it clarifies positions of histories that vis-a-vis the Indian history. Yeah, and she takes each of them. She does not sort of discount any one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll put that link in the chat box here later. But yeah, any other responses?
So which direction do you think we should go next? We have the truth is that there are many directions we can go with you guys, na? Lajja like both. Now what to do?
Yeah. Isms also. Isms. Yeah.
So okay, let's just talk about the next class. Okay, next class has two options. We'll give you two options for next class. One is that we continue with the Indian modernity question. We do the Bengal Renaissance, look at the effect of the Bengal Renaissance, because that's one of the big reform movements that are there. Great paintings, great architecture, interesting architecture rather, all comes over, and the idea of Indianness can be seen in that work. Or the other option is that we kind of go back to the 19th century and go international again and look at France and England and look at the different ways in which ideal cities were imagined at that time by different sorts of. These are the two options that are there. So let's have a vote. So okay, let's you can do these. You can
Bengal.
do these.
Bengal.
Okay. There are two. There's a. You can put a like, na. Let's see who gets more likes. So. Shreyansh, okay, Keyur is whom we are counting. So whoever wants Indian reformism goes to Keyur, and second option is the international, which is Risha. So whoever wants the international utopias, industrial utopias, like Risha's post. Yeah, I like this. This is voting. This is fun. We have to find ways of getting this alive, man. This is fun. Risha.
But Keyur is way ahead. Huh?
Yeah, but no one is liking Risha at all.
Yeah, I will like Risha, sure. I like Risha. So Risha doesn't feel left alone. Three people are like Risha.
Yay.
But otherwise, if you count Keyur and Shreyansh, it's like it's way outnumbering.
Already 40. Yeah, it's already 40 now.
Okay, the decision is done. The vote is over.
Are people who kind of clicked on Shreyansh also clicking on Keyur's? Because that's the same. Indian modernism and Shreyansh is the same, no?
Let me see.
Yeah,
Let me see. You all are clicking on. Okay. Just scroll back. Okay. I don't know. Maybe some of them are there. Some of them.
I think overwhelmingly it's going to be the Bengal Renaissance next week.
Okay.
But what I think we'll do is that in the second year we are doing two classes on the Bengal Renaissance. What we'll do is that we'll kind of combine both of them into one lecture. So again, it might be long. Okay. Now you better not complain.
So there is an interesting book by Shashi Tharoor called The Dark Ages, which basically historic criticism about atrocities committed by colonialists on their subjects. Yeah. Yeah.
But you know, if you think, you know, I recently finished a history of Africa. Okay, I read this book. If you look at the atrocities committed by the colonial kind of powers, especially the British in India, and you compare it with what they did in Africa, हमारा तो कुछ नहीं है दोस्त, हमारा तो कुछ नहीं है. I think India has received the least of the colonial atrocities. The worst was Africa, and I don't even want to talk about America, North and South America. Those are like genocidal, you know. And Australia. These three continents, I think, have got the worst. Those are the worst stories.
Okay, Rohan,
Uh,
I'll put the two questions here for them now.
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, let's do
just
that. Yeah.
let's do that. And so the first question is.
No, you have to tell them what you're doing, though. You explain
Yeah,
context of this for them.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
tell them
I'll
why
do
we are
that.
doing this. Because otherwise they'll just think SH photo question.
Okay, so this is question number one. So what we are doing is we want you guys to think about these two questions, and we want you guys to respond through your blog on these two questions. Okay, both of the questions are emerging from what the lecture has been today, and they will be continually repeating some of the questions. Okay, but think about these two questions. Here's the first one. Okay, this is first. Yeah, and this is the second one.
Wow, red mein. Exciting.
Madhura, I think she can't see the questions. Why?
Why?
Because it's red. Just put it in
Should I
black.
try putting them?
No, I can't see the.
Okay, I
I
said
see some other chat.
Yeah, even some other chat.
no.
I couldn't see.
Can you see? I just
Shreya's
posted a question right
messages
now.
also. I was trying to like, but I can't see there.
Now, could you see, Madhura? I just put a question now. Did you see?
No.
Can you see? No? Then maybe you need to
Can anyone else see?
sign out. Can the others see?
Ashwini, can you see the question?
We can see.
Yeah, we can see the question.
Oh, send it to us.
Okay. Yeah, I'll
It's
ask them to solve.
Very
Madhura,
simple.
it's Madhura's problem.
One is look at the idea of the break of the past. Just find the break in the past and look at it. And the second is any colonial institution, look at its architecture and talk about it. Right now, these are the two questions.
These are the
Yes.
The reason why we are giving you these questions just so that it becomes something to kind of also fill your blogs with, because from my understanding, they have not been particularly very productive. Chal. Okay, so Bengal Renaissance next week. Shantiniketan and others. Okay, ciao. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye guys.